beautiful people. Sunshine here. Welcome to another episode of Energize Your Passion, where we dive deep into the things that make us better, brighter, and bolder. Today's episode is one I know many of us grapple with. How do you balance being selfish with your time and money versus freely giving? I don't know about you, but I've found myself on both ends of the spectrum. Sometimes giving way too much and other times feeling guilty when I take a step back to focus on me. Sounds familiar? Well, let's break it down together. Grab your tea, coffee, or whatever keeps you cozy, and let's get into it. Segment 1. The importance of self-care and setting boundaries. Let's start with the ideal of self-care and how it's connected to setting boundaries. We live in a society that often equates self-care with being selfish. But here's the truth. If you don't prioritize yourself, who will? Setting boundaries with your time and money is essential to protecting your well-being. And it's not selfish. It's necessary. You can't pour from an empty cup, right? But there's a fine line between self-care and pushing people away. The question is, how do we walk that line? Now let's break this down a bit more because I think a lot of us confuse self-care with indulgence. When I say self-care, I'm not talking about those spa days. Though, don't get me wrong, a good spa day can work wonders. Yes, it can. But self-care goes much deeper than that. It's about taking care of your mental, emotional, and physical well-being on a consistent basis. It's about honoring your own needs so that you can show up fully for others. I think many of us struggle with the guilt of saying no. We've been conditioned to believe that our worth is tied to how much we can give. So when we set a boundary, it feels uncomfortable, like we're letting someone down. But here's the thing. Consistently giving without checking in on yourself will eventually lead to burnout. And when you're burned out, you're no good to anyone, not to your family, not to your friends, and definitely not to yourself. A friend of mine, let's call her Mia, shared her experience about being a yes person. She gave so much of her time and energy and even her money to everyone in her life. It was her way of showing love, but over time she started feeling drained, overwhelmed, and even resentful. Mia had to take a hard look at her life and realize that she wasn't practicing healthy boundaries. She was giving, but she wasn't refilling her own tank. Have you ever felt that way? Wow, Mia's story is one I think so many of us can relate to. We've all been in situations where we're overextended ourselves, thinking we're being generous, but really, we're doing more harm than good. Mia felt resentful, and that resentment can quickly build up until it explodes. And it's not just in personal relationships. It can happen at work too. Maybe you're the go-to person for every task or every request and saying no feels impossible. But let me tell you something. Saying yes to everything isn't sustainable. Now I know some of you are probably thinking, but Sunshine, if I don't say yes, who will? I don't want to let people down. Trust me, I get it. But here's where the magic of boundaries comes in. Boundaries don't mean you care less about others. They mean you care enough about yourself to ensure you can continue caring for others in the long run. Setting a boundary doesn't make you selfish. It makes you self-aware. So how do we go about setting boundaries without feeling like we're alienating people? First, I want you to shift your mindset. Instead of thinking about boundaries as walls you put up to put people out, think of them as guidelines that help you protect your energy. It's about protecting your time, your mental health, and your peace of mind. Practical tips for setting boundaries. Let's get practical for a second. When it comes to setting boundaries, there are a few things I've found really helpful. Number one, be clear and direct. People can't respect your boundaries if they don't know what they are. Be clear about your limits, whether it's your time, your money, or your emotional energy. For example, if you're asked to help out with something and you're already feeling overwhelmed, you can say, I love to help, but I'm at capacity right now. Can we revisit this later? Number two, practice saying no without apology. This is a big one. So many of us have this habit of apologizing when we say no, as if we've done something wrong. You don't need to apologize for protecting your well-being. A simple, I can't make it, but thank you for thinking of me works wonders. It's polite, it's firm, and most importantly, it respects your boundary. Number three, prioritize your needs. Remember, setting boundaries isn't about neglecting others. It's about making sure you're in the best possible position to support the people you care about. Think of it like an oxygen mask on an airplane. You have to secure your own mask first before helping others. The same principle applies to your life. Number four, consistency is key. Setting boundaries is one thing, but sticking to them is where the real challenge lies. People may push back, especially if they're used to you always saying yes. That's okay. Stay consistent with your boundaries, and over time, people around you will adjust. Okay, so now that we've touched on why boundaries are so important and how to set them, let's talk about how it feels when we don't. Like Mia's story showed us, when we don't set boundaries, we open ourselves up to a whole host of negative emotions, resentment, frustration, and burnout. But when we do set boundaries, something amazing happens. We feel lighter. We feel more in control of our time and our energy. And here's the best part. When you set boundaries, you actually improve your relationships with others. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but think about it. When you're always giving more than you can handle, you're not showing up as your best self. You're tired, you're drained, and maybe you even a little bitter. But when you set boundaries, you're able to give from a place of abundance, not exhaustion. And that makes a world of difference. Now, I know some of you might be wondering, but what if people don't respect my boundaries? What if they get upset? Well, here's the tough truth. Not everyone is going to be thrilled when you start setting boundaries. Some people might feel like you're pulling away or that you're not as available as you used to be. And that's okay. You're not responsible for other people's reactions. You're responsible for your own well-being. How to handle pushback. When you do encounter pushback, stay firm but compassionate. You can acknowledge someone's feelings without sacrificing your boundary. For instance, if a friend is upset that you're not available to hang out as often, you can say something like, I understand you're disappointed and I value our friendship, but I need to focus on my personal time right now. This way, you're validating their feelings while still holding your boundary. And remember, setting boundaries is a process. It's not going to feel comfortable right away, especially if you're used to always being the yes person. But the more you practice, the easier it becomes. Eventually, you'll find that setting boundaries doesn't just protect your energy, it empowers you. Before we move on to the next segment, let's circle back to that ideal of self-care. Let's circle back to this ideal of self-care. I want you to really think about what self-care looks like for you. It doesn't have to be the same for everyone. For some, it might mean carving out time to read a good book, while for others, it could be taking a long walk or even spending time with family. Whatever refuels your spirit, whatever refuels your spirit. The key to making sure that you're consistently refilling your cup so that when you give, you're giving from a place of abundance, not depletion. Final thoughts on self-care and boundaries. So the next time you're faced with the choice of saying yes or no, I want you to pause and ask yourself, do I have the energy for this? Am I saying yes because I want to or I feel like I have to? If the answer is no, that's okay. Give yourself permission to say no without guilt. Your time and energy are valuable, and it's up to you to decide how you spend them. All right, we've covered a lot in this first segment about the importance of self-care and setting boundaries. I hope you're already feeling empowered to start protecting your time and energy in a way that serves you. Up next, we're going to dive into the joy of giving and how to do so without losing yourself in the process. Stay tuned. Segment 2, the joy and impact of giving. All right. Now that we've explored the importance of self-care and boundaries, let's flip the script and talk about the joy of giving. Giving is one of the most beautiful things we can do, whether it's your time, money, or energy. There's something special about helping others, but like everything in life, it's about balance. I want you to think about the last time you helped someone without expecting anything in return. You did. How did it feel? That warm, fuzzy feeling you get from giving is no accident. Studies actually show that generosity boosts happiness. It releases endorphins, those feel-good chemicals in our brains. When we give freely, we strengthen our relationships and reinforce the sense that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. It's like creating a ripple effect, and you never know how far your act of kindness will travel. But here's where the tricky part comes in. How do we give without losing ourselves in the process? Let's dive a little deeper into that. We often talk about the joy of giving, and for good reason. It's powerful. But what happens when giving becomes too much? What happens when the act of generosity, something that's meant to bring you joy and connection, start to feel like a burden? I think we've all been there at some point, right? We give and give because it feels good. But then, before you know it, we're drained. And that's when the resentment can start to creep in. It's that fine line between giving from a place of abundance and giving when we're running on fumes. Here's the thing. Giving should always come from a place of choice, not obligation. When you give because you feel obligated or because you think it's what you should do, it's not really giving. It's sacrificing. And there's a big difference between the two. Giving is about sharing your energy, your time, your resources because you want to, because it feels good and meaningful. Sacrificing, on the other hand, is when you give because you feel like you have to, even when it's detrimental to you. Let me tell you about Jason, another friend of mine. Jason has always been the guy everyone turns to when they need a favor, and he loves helping people. He's the type to stay late after work, to help a coworker, or lend money to a friend in need, no questions asked. He thrives on being the go-to guy, but after a while, Jason started feeling stretched too thin. He found himself saying yes to things he didn't really want to do, just because it was expected of him. Jason realized that while giving made him happy, he was also losing a bit of himself by always being available. He had to learn that it's okay to say, not this time. Jason's story hits home, doesn't it? I think a lot of us have been in his shoes, feeling torn between wanting to help and realizing that constantly being the yes person comes at a cost. Giving is a beautiful thing, but we need to be mindful of the toll it can take if we're not careful. So while giving is incredible, we need to make sure it doesn't leave us running on empty. Generosity shouldn't come at the expense of your own well-being. That's where balance comes in. Let's talk about that balance for a second. Because feeling the right balance between giving and preserving your own energy is key to long-term happiness. Think of it like a bank account. You can't keep withdrawing money without making deposits, right? Eventually your account will be overdrawn. And that's when stress and burnout creeps in. The same goes for your emotional and physical energy. You need to replenish when you give out so you don't end up drained. Practical tips for finding balance in giving. Here are a few practical tips for striking that balance between giving and self-preservation. Number one, check in with yourself first. Before you say yes to helping someone or giving your time, check in with yourself. Ask yourself, do I have the time or energy to give right now? If the answer is no, it's perfectly okay to say no. You're not being selfish. You're being responsible with your energy. Number two, set clear limits. We talked about setting boundaries earlier, and this applies here as well. Set clear limits on how much you can give, whether it's your time, your money, or your emotional energy. For example, if you've already had a full day at work and someone asks you to stay late, it's okay to say, I'm sorry. I've already given my best today, but maybe we can find another solution tomorrow. It's about pacing yourself. Number three, give what feels good. There's a difference between giving because you feel obligated and giving because you genuinely want to. When you give from a place of joy, it feels good and it doesn't drain you. So make sure that when you give, it's something you feel positive about. If you're giving out of guilt or pressure, it might be time to reconsider. Number four, practice saying no with compassion. You don't have to be harsh or abrupt when saying no. You can say something like, I love to help, but I'm not in a position to give right now. This way, you're honoring your own limits while still being kind and respectful to the other person. Number five, celebrate small acts of kindness. Not every act of giving has to be grand. Sometimes the smallest gestures, like offering a smile or holding the door open for someone, can make a big impact. Recognize that even the little things count, and they don't always require a huge amount of energy or time. I think one of the biggest misconceptions we have about giving is that we always have to go all out for it to be meaningful. But that's not true at all. Sometimes giving in small, intentional ways can have a ripple effect that you never expected. Think about it. Something that as simple as sending a kind text to a friend who's going through a tough time can lift their spirits and make their day. It doesn't take much, but it makes a huge difference. Now let's talk about how giving not only impacts the person receiving, but also benefits you, the giver. There's a lot of research out there that shows how giving can improve your mental and emotional health. Studies have found that people who engage in regular acts of kindness and generosity report higher levels of life satisfaction, lower stress levels, and even improved physical health. It's because giving taps into something fundamental about being human. It connects us to others in a meaningful way. One study I came across found that people who volunteer their time regularly tend to feel a greater sense of purpose in their lives. They feel more connected to their communities and more fulfilled overall. And it makes sense, right? When you give, you're reminded that you're part of something bigger than ourselves. We're reminded that we have the power to make a difference, even if it's in small ways. But here's the part I really want to emphasize. Giving doesn't always have to be selfless to be good. It's okay to recognize that when you give, you're also receiving something in return. Maybe it's a sense of joy, fulfillment, or connection. Maybe it's the knowledge that you've made someone's day a little brighter. And that's a beautiful thing. Giving is a two-way street, and there's no shame in acknowledging that you benefit from it too. Exploring the concept of selfish giving. Now I know the term selfish giving might sound a little strange at first, but hold on, hear me out. When I say selfish giving, I don't mean giving with strings attached or with the expectation of getting something in return. What I mean is that it's perfectly okay to give in ways that also benefit you emotionally or spiritually. Maybe you volunteer at an organization that aligns with your values, or you donate to a cause that you're passionate about. You're still giving, but it's also feeding your soul in some way. And that's a good thing. So the next time you think about giving, I want you to ask yourself, is this something that will bring me joy, or am I doing it out of obligation? If it's the latter, it might be time to reassess. Giving should always be a choice, one that leaves you feeling enriched, not depleted. And don't forget, giving isn't just about grand gestures or big sacrifices. Sometimes it's the small, everyday acts of kindness that make the biggest impact. Like we said earlier, sending a thoughtful message, offering a helping hand, or even just listening to someone who needs to talk. All of these are forms of giving that don't require you to stretch yourself too thin. All right, we've explored the joy and impact of giving and how it can lift us up. But we also talked about the importance of balance, making sure that your generosity doesn't come at the expense of your well-being. In the next segment, we're going to shift gears and talk about another important topic, how to navigate the fine line between giving freely and protecting your time and energy. Stay with me. Segment 3, aligning your values with your actions. Now that we've touched on both sides, being selfish with your time and money versus giving freely, I want to talk about something crucial: alignment. What I mean by that is making sure your actions match your values. Let me ask you this. What are your values when it comes to time and money? For some people, it's all about family. For others, it's about personal growth, career, or contributing to a cause they care about. Whatever your values are, the key to balance is making sure your actions reflect them. If you value your family, but are consistently working and giving your time elsewhere, something's off. And if you value helping others, but you feel guilty every time you do something for yourself, that's a red flag too. I think it is really important to take a moment to reflect on this because more often than not, we get caught up in the daily grind and forget to check in if what we're doing aligns with what we care about. We move through life on autopilot, saying yes to things because we feel obligated or no because we think we don't have time. But what would happen if we actually pause to ask ourselves, does this align with my values? Think about that for a second. Maybe you value your health, but you haven't made time to prioritize it. Or maybe you've been saying yes to social events. What you really want is some quiet time for self-reflection. The disconnection between your actions and values create friction. It's like swimming upstream. You're going against the current and it leaves you feeling exhausted, stressed, or unfulfilled. But when you align your actions with your values, it's like everything clicks into place. You're in flow and life feels more purposeful. I remember talking to someone, I'll call her Kelly, who always felt conflicted about how much time she spent at work versus with her family. Kelly was a high achiever and she loved her job. But at the same time, she knew that being present for her kids were incredibly important to her. She wanted to advance in her career, but her heart kept telling her that family time was more important. Kelly had to make some tough decisions about where she invested her time and energy. She ended up taking a step back from her job to find more time for her family. Once she aligned her actions with her values, she found peace in her choices. Even though she had to sacrifice some career advancement, Kelly felt much more fulfilled in her role as a mother. Kelly's story is one that a lot of people can relate to, whether you're juggling work or family, personal passions and commitments, or financial responsibilities. The tension between what you should do and what you want to do is real. But here's the thing. It's not about making everyone else happy. It's about finding a way to live your life that honors your values. When you live in alignment with what matters most to you, the conflict fades and you can make decisions with confidence. So how do you figure out if your actions align with your values? It starts with clarity, understanding what your values actually are. Sometimes we go through life assuming we know what's important to us. But when we take a closer look, we might realize that what we thought we valued was shaped by external pressures, society, family expectations, or the demands of work. It's easy to fall into the trap of living for other people's expectations without even realizing it. That's why it's crucial to get clear on what you truly value. I want to walk you through an exercise that can help you align your actions with your values. It's simple but powerful. First, take out a piece of paper or open the note apps on your phone and make 2 lists. On one side, write down your core values. These could be things like family, health, financial stability, personal growth, or spirituality. On the other side, write down how you currently spend your time, energy, and money. Be honest with yourself. Are you spending your time in ways that reflect your values? Is your financial investment in line with what's important to you? Here's an example. If family is one of your top values, but you're spending most of your time working late nights or on a project that pulls you away from loved ones, that's a sign that something is out of alignment. Or maybe you value personal growth, but you haven't invested in yourself, whether it's taking a class, reading a book, or pursuing a hobby that challenges you. The goal isn't to make yourself feel guilty about where you're at. It's to identify areas where you can start making small shifts. Once you've got your list, ask yourself, where do I want to make adjustments? How can I start taking action that better reflect what I want most? The ideal is to start living with intention and making decisions that bring you closer to your ideal life. Another way to think about alignment is through the lens of opportunity costs. Every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. When your actions don't match your values, you're often saying yes to things that don't serve your higher purpose. And in doing so, you're sacrificing time, energy, or money that could be going towards what really matters. For example, if you value financial security, but you're constantly spending money on things that don't align with that value, it's going to be harder to reach your goals. Opportunity cost also applies to time. If you're saying yes to a social obligation that drains your energy this or commitments that don't fulfill you, you're saying no to activities that could nourish you, whether it's spending time with loved ones, focusing on self-care, or pursuing a passion project. Alignment is about making conscious choices that serve your higher purpose instead of getting swept up in the currents of daily life. Let's talk for a moment about financial alignment. Money is one of those tricky areas where it's easy to feel out of sync with your values. Maybe you value freedom and flexibility, but you're spending your money in ways that keep you tied up in a lifestyle you don't love. Or perhaps you value generosity and giving back, but you found yourself holding on to money out of fear or scarcity. Money out of fear or scarcity. Financial alignment doesn't mean you need to give everything away, nor does it mean you have to sacrifice your financial goals. It's about being intentional with your resources so that they reflect your values. One strategy I've found helpful is setting specific financial intentions that align with your core values. For example, if financial security is important to you, create a budget that prioritizes saving and responsible spending. If generosity is one of your top values, allocate a portion of your income towards causes you care about or set aside a giving fund that allows you to give without feeling financially strained. The key is to make your financial decision with purpose so they reflect what truly matters to you. And of course, it's not just about how you spend your money. It's also about how you invest your time. Time, like money, is limited resource. So when you're deciding how to spend your time, ask yourself, does this align with my values? For example, If personal growth is top priority, make sure you're carving out time for learning, self-reflection, or pursuing new challenges. If family is your core value, then you may want to reassess how much time you're dedicating to work or other activities that pull you away from the people who really matter most. The point here isn't to be rigid or overly strict with yourself. Life happens, and there will always be times when you need to compromise or make sacrifices. But the more you can live in alignment with your values, the more balanced and fulfilled you'll feel. It's about making sure that overall your actions are in harmony with what you truly care about. One thing I've learned is that alignment doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, a continuous practice of checking in with yourself, making adjustments, and course correcting when necessary. Sometimes you'll find that certain values take priorities over others at different stages in your life, and that's okay. What's important is that you stay mindful and intentional about how you're living and that you give yourself grace as you navigate this journey of aligning your actions with your values. So as you move forward, I encourage you to take some time to reflect. Think about where you're at, where you want to be, and what small steps you can take to bring your life into greater alignment. It doesn't have to be a dramatic overhaul. Even small shifts can make a big difference in how you feel and how you move through the world. All right. We've talked about the importance of aligning your actions with your values, how it's key to finding balance and living with intention. In the next segment, we're going to explore the concept of boundaries again, but through a different lens. How to set healthy boundaries without feeling guilty? Stay tuned. Segment 4, Navigating Guilt and Expectations. Now, let's get into a topic that I think we all can relate to. Guilt and managing the expectations of others. It is tough, right? We feel guilty for saying no or not giving enough of ourselves, whether it's time, money, or energy. And sometimes the pressure comes from people who expect us to always be available or generous. But here's the thing, guilt isn't always a bad thing. It's our brain's way of telling us we're not living up to some expectations. The trick is figuring out if that expectation is one we should even be trying to meet in the first place. Let's be real for a moment. How often have you felt guilty for saying no, even when you knew deep down that saying yes would leave you exhausted and overwhelmed? That's because many of us are conditioned to feel like we're letting others down if we're not constantly giving. But the truth is sometimes those expectations are unreasonable and they don't align with our priorities. Think about it like this. Guilt is like an alarm going off. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a signal that something needs your attention. The real challenge is to determine whether that alarm is signaling a true misstep, like neglecting your own values, or whether it's going off because you're trying to live up to someone else's standards that don't serve you. If the latter is true, you have permission to turn that alarm off. One of my listeners, Danielle, shared a story about how she used to feel guilty for not being able to attend every family gathering. She worked full time and was also trying to build her own business on the side. Her family expected her to show up for everything: birthdays, Sunday dinners, holiday events, and When she couldn't, the guilt was overwhelming. Danielle found herself torn between pursuing her dreams and meeting her family's expectations. She rushed from work events to family gatherings, exhausted and unable to give her full attention to either. But after a lot of self-reflection, Danielle learned to let go of the guilt by understanding that her time was limited and precious. She realized it was okay to prioritize herself sometime. She started having open conversations with her family about her goals and commitments, explaining that while she loved them, she needed to create some boundaries to preserve her energy and focus on her business. And you know what? Her family eventually understood. They didn't want her to feel overwhelmed either. Once Danielle let go of the guilt, she found a healthier balance between family obligations and her personal goals. Danielle's story is so relatable because so many of us struggle with this exact scenario, feeling pulled in multiple directions and guilty for not meeting everyone's expectations. But here's the reality. You cannot be everything to everyone. And the sooner you release yourself from the pressure of trying, the more freedom you'll feel. That guilt is just a sign that you're pushing up against someone's expectations. But you have to ask yourself, are those expectations reasonable? And do they align with your values? This brings me to a really important point about guilt. Not all guilt is created equal. Some guilt is a result of violating your own values. In those cases, it's important to listen to that feeling. For example, if you value integrity, but you've been acting in a way that doesn't reflect that, guilt can be a helpful reminder to course correct. But when guilt is tied to someone else's expectation that doesn't align with your values, that's when you need to reassess and let go of that feeling. It's not serving you. Let's break this down a bit more. Say you have a friend who always expects you to be available to listen to their problems, no matter how busy or tired you are. And you do it because you're a good friend, right? But after a while, you start to feel drained. You're giving more of your time and emotional energy than you're able to. And now that guilt kicks in when you even think about saying no. But here's the question. Is it fair to feel guilty for needing space to recharge? Should someone else's expectation of your availability take precedence over your own need for self-care? The answer is no. It's perfectly okay to say no. In fact, it's necessary for your well-being. You don't owe anybody constant access to your time or emotional resources. And feeling guilty for saying no is often a sign that the expectations placed on you are out of balance with your own needs. And that brings us to managing expectations. People will often have expectations of you, whether it's friends, family, co-workers, or even society. But it's up to you to decide which expectations you're going to meet and which ones you need to let go of. Here's the thing. If you don't set those boundaries, people will continue to expect more from you. Not because they're being selfish, because they don't know your limits unless you communicate them. You teach people how to treat you by the boundaries you set. Let's go back to Danielle's story for a moment. One of the reasons her family had such high expectations was because she was always saying yes. She had set a pattern of being available, so they came to expect that from her. It wasn't until she set clear boundaries and communicated her needs that the expectations began to shift. And yes, there was a little guilt at first, but over time she realized that taking care of herself allowed her to be more present and engaged when she did spend time with her family. I want to encourage you to think about the expectations in your own life. Who's placing expectations on you? Are they fair? Do they align with your values? Sometimes we don't even realize how much pressure we're under until we stop and take stock of what's being asked of us. If you're feeling weighed down by the expectations of others, it's time to reassess and set some boundaries. This might mean having uncomfortable conversations, but in the long run, it's worth it. Here's another thing about expectations. They can also come from within. Sometimes we place unrealistic expectations on ourselves. We feel like we have to be perfect, that we can't let anyone down, or that we need to do it all. And when we inevitably fall short, that's when guilt creeps in. But listen, no one is perfect. You're allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to prioritize yourself. You don't even have to meet everyone's expectation, especially the ones that aren't aligned with your values. Let's dive a little deeper into the concept of guilt. One of the things that make guilt so challenging is that it can feel so deeply ingrained in us. Many of us were raised to believe that putting ourselves first is selfish, and that belief sticks with us as we grow older. But self-care isn't selfish. Taking time for yourself isn't selfish. Saying no when you're overwhelmed isn't selfish. It's self-preservation. And when you take care of yourself, you're actually in a better position to give to others, whether that's your time, energy, or resources, because you're giving from a place of abundance rather than depletion. This is something I've seen time and time again with people who are natural givers. They give and give and give and give until they have nothing left. And when they reach that point of burnout, they feel guilty for not being able to give anymore. If they had allowed themselves to prioritize self-care, they wouldn't have reached that point of depletion. So how do we let go of that guilt? It starts with shifting our mindset. Instead of thinking, I'm letting someone down by saying no, try thinking, I'm protecting my well-being so I can continue to show up for the people I care about in a sustainable way. Instead of thinking, I'm being selfish by not giving more, try thinking, I'm setting healthy boundaries so I can give from a place of fullness, not exhaustion. It's about reframing the way we think about guilt and recognizing that setting boundaries isn't about withholding. It's about creating space for yourself to thrive. And trust me, once you start letting go of that guilt, you'll feel a huge sense of relief. It's like a weight has been lifted off your shoulders and you're free to live your life in a way that feels aligned with your values. Before we wrap up this segment, I want to leave you with this. You are not responsible for meeting everyone's expectations. You are responsible for taking care of yourself and living in alignment with your values. That might mean saying no sometime. It might mean disappointing a few people along the way. But ultimately, you'll be creating a life that feels fulfilling, balanced, and true to who you are. All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this segment. Navigating guilt, managing expectations, and setting boundaries that protect your well-being. In the next and final segment, we'll talk about finding the right balance between being selfish and giving, and how to know when you've achieved that sweet spot in your life. Segment 5. Striking the perfect balance. All right. We've covered a lot today, haven't we? From self-care and boundaries to giving and guilt. We've looked at the topic from every angle. So how do you bring it all together? How do you strike that perfect balance between being selfish with your time and money versus freely giving? When you think about balance, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one might not work for you, and that's okay. The key is to find what feels right for you at this particular moment in your life. And here's the thing, balance is fluid. It changes as you go through different stages in your life. What felt like balance in your 20s might look completely different in your 50s. The important thing is that you remain aware and intentional about how you're spending your time, money, and energy. It comes down to a few simple questions. And these are the questions that will help you check in with yourself regularly. Number one, are you taking care of yourself first so that you can give from a place of abundance? This is the foundation of everything we've talked about it throughout the episode. Self-care isn't selfish, it's necessary. You can't pour from an empty cup. And if you're running on fumes, you won't be able to give in a meaningful way to others. So you are making sure you're refueling your own energy first, whether it's through rest, hobbies, or just taking time to breathe. Self-care must be a priority before we can effectively give to others. Number two, are you giving in a way that aligns with your values? This question digs into the heart of your actions. We've touched on the importance of aligning your time, money, and energy with what matters most to you. If you're constantly giving to causes or people that don't resonate with your core values, it's going to feel draining, not fulfilling. So take a moment to think when you give. Are you doing it because it reflects who you are and what you believe in? Or are you giving out of obligation or guilt? Number three, are you setting healthy boundaries to protect your well-being? Boundaries are the unsure hero of balance. They protect your time, your energy, and your mental health. Without boundaries, even the most well-intended giving can lead to burnout. Remember, it's okay to say no. It's okay to put yourself first sometimes. If you don't, you won't be able to show up fully when it's time to give. Number four, are you letting go of guilt and honoring your own limits? Guilt can be a heavy burden, especially when it comes to giving. We often feel guilty for not being able to do everything or be everywhere at once. But guilt, as we've discussed, is often tied to expectations, either from others or from ourselves. Are you holding onto guilt for not meeting unrealistic expectations? Or are you honoring your limits and giving yourself the grace to know that it's okay not to do it all? Before we wrap up, let me share one last listener story. Sarah had always struggled with balance. She was either giving too much or holding back entirely. She went from one extreme to the other, constantly overextending herself to help others and then withdrawing completely because she felt so drained. It wasn't until she started asking herself those key questions that she found her sweet spot. Sarah realized that by taking care of herself first, she had more to give to others. She began setting boundaries, something she had never done before, and started giving in ways that aligned with her values. Now Sarah's living her life in a way that honors her values and her time, while still giving generously to the people she loves. That's the balance we're all striving for, isn't it? So, my friends, it's about finding that harmony between taking care of yourself and giving to others. Remember, you're worthy of your own time and energy just as much as anyone else. Sometimes we can get caught up in thinking that to be a good person, we need to give and give and give without ever thinking about ourselves. But the truth is, by taking care of yourself, you're not only honoring your own needs, you're ensuring that you can give more effectively when the time comes. Let's talk a little more about what striking that balance look like in real life. It's easy to talk about self-care and boundaries in theory, but how do we put it into practice? It starts with knowing your limits. Take a moment to reflect on how much time and energy you realistically have to give. What are your non-negotiables? Maybe it's a quiet hour in the morning for yourself, or perhaps it's setting a financial boundary so you're not giving beyond what you can afford. Whatever it is, know what you need to thrive and protect it fiercely. And here's the other piece. Balance requires constant reassessment. Life changes, circumstances changes, and what worked for you last year might not work for you now. Maybe you're in a season of life where you have more to give, whether that's financially, emotionally, or with your time. And that's great. But if you're in a season where your resources are stretched thin, that's okay too. The balance will look different depending on where you are in your life. And that's why it's important to keep checking in with yourself. I want to emphasize that balance doesn't mean giving equally to yourself and others at all times. Sometimes life can require you to give more to others, and that's okay. Other times you need to focus more on yourself, and that's okay too. The key is to make sure that over the long run, you're not neglecting one side entirely. It's about the overall picture, not the day-to-day details. As we wrap up, let's recap some of the key takeaways from today's episode. Self-care is essential. You cannot pour from an empty cup. Prioritize yourself so you can give from a place of abundance. This isn't just about taking time for yourself. It's about making sure you're emotionally and mentally prepared to give to others without losing yourself in the process. The joy of giving. Giving is powerful and rewarding, but it should never come at the expense of your well-being. When you give from a place of alignment with your values, it becomes a source of joy rather than stress. Align your values with your actions. Ensure that your decisions about time, money, and energy reflect your true priorities. When your actions match your values, you'll find that balance comes more naturally. Let go of guilt. You don't owe anyone your time and energy. Setting boundaries that work for you and letting go of guilt is a game changer when it comes to finding balance. Find your balance. The perfect balance between selfishness and giving looks different for everyone. It's not about giving equally in all areas of your life. It's about listening to yourself and adjusting your boundaries as needed. Balance is personal, and it's okay if your version of balance looks different from someone else's. Thank you for tuning in today's episode of Energize Your Passion. I hope you found some insights that help you strike the right balance in your own life. Remember, it's all about living in harmony with your values and taking care of yourself so that you can give generously when the time is right. If you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to do me a favor. Give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review. It helps. Share this episode with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to more content that energizes your passion. You can always find more on the blog at EnergizeURPassion.com and follow along on Instagram for daily inspirations. Until next time, take care of yourself, embrace your passion, and remember, you are worthy of your own love and care. Thanks for being here, and I'll catch you in the next episode. This is Sunshine, signing off.